Hello, this is my video about the English Civil War. England in the 1600s. There was a really big conflict between Stuarts and Parliament regarding the religious and political events during that time period. This led to the English Civil War, and then that led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which resulted in a constitutional government in England. There was King James I, which succeeded Queen Elizabeth, and he was also King James IV of Scotland, and when he became King of England, both countries joined in a personal union. He believed in absolutism and the divine right theory that was popular at the time, and during this time there was a lot of religious tension. He claimed that there was no bishop, no king, and response to Calvinists who wanted to get rid of the bishop system in England. Charles I would also use this quote, but there was a lot of controversy surrounding it, as there was because of the religious tensions of this time. The economy was also very fragile. It was partially because of Elizabeth's war deaths, but also because of Jane I's spending on frivolous and useless things. He also brought unintelligent people to the courts, such as the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke convinced the king to sell peerages and titles and other privileges to whoever wanted to pay. Parliament opposed this way to gather money, and Parliament during this time was composed of the House of Commons, of small land-owning gentry, and House of Lords, which also owned land but were very wealthy and rich. And Charles I came after James I, and he was very indecisive and shy, and he rejected the view that he should appoint a variety of religious and political spectrums in his ministers. There was a lot of religious tension during this time, and he said that people are governed by the pulpit more than the sword in time of peace. And this was very true. With all the Protestant new sects that formed during the Reformation, there was a lot of tension in England between Catholics, Anglicans, and the newly formed Puritans. Puritans were hoping to purify Anglicans of Catholic influence, and the main things that they stood for can be remembered by their name. P can be for predestination, U for uncomplicated, for their simple ways of living, R for rejecting of bishops, I for individual preaching of the church, true church, as I believe they were instead of Anglicans, and anti-Catholic, and N for navigated to the New World, as they escaped persecution. They were less than 10% of the population, but they had a pretty big influence during this time. There was a fear of a popish plot to restore Catholicism as the national religion of England during this time. But Charles also had dissatisfaction with his fiscal policies. In 1625, he forced landowners to pay a tax without asking for Parliament's consent. And then when people refused to pay this tax, he imprisoned them. Charles asked Parliament to provide him with more funds, and Parliament procured the Petition of Right, which forced Charles to accept that Parliament had to be asked for consent and that there could not be any arbitrary arrests. And Charles' reaction to this was to break Parliament away in 1629, and the next 11 years, Charles ruled without Parliament as an absolutist monarch. And he tried to raise money in very controversial ways, such as ship money, where people in land had to pay a tax in order to outfit ships for the Royal Navy and such. He also led to a rebellion in Scotland as he seized land from Scottish nobles and imposed the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on the Presbyterian Church. The National Convent was formed by Scottish leaders attacking the book and the religion, and both sides rose up in arms. This was a turning point in Charles' reign. He was desperate for funds and demanded that London pay for the war, and London consented in exchange that Charles had to convene Parliament in a reasonable amount of time. So in 1640, he summoned Parliament since 11 years, and when it refused to allocate funds for the war until Charles accepted a list of grievances, he dissolved the short Parliament after less than 2 months. This was the beginning of the English Civil War, which was a political crisis that became more about how England was to be governed than anything else. The conflict happened as the King Charles attempted a coup against Parliament in 1642, and when that failed, he escaped to London, leaving a lot of supporters to leave Parliament. So there were two sides: the Cavaliers, which were for the King, and the Roundheads, which were for Parliament, and were led by Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan and military leader of the new model army. And there was little actual fighting and short campaign seasons and only four major battles. But for the first time in history, it was a war of words. Propaganda sprouted, and more than 22,000 newspapers, pamphlets, etc., were published during the time of the English Civil War. There was also a division between Puritans and Presbyterians in the New Model Army, leading to Pride's Purge, in which all non-Puritans were removed from Parliament, leaving a rump Parliament with only one-fifth of its members. The war ended in 1649 with Charles I's execution, the first king in history to be executed by his own subjects, and new sects emerged, like the Levelers, the Diggers, and Quakers. And this led to the period known as the Interregnum, which was a rule without a king, which included the Commonwealth, a failed republic that abolished the monarchy, and then later the Protectorate, a dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. And he dissolved the Rump Parliament, he denied religious freedoms to Anglicans and Catholics, he allowed Jews to return to England, he invaded Ireland and killed about 50 to 20% of its population, he ruled over Scotland, and he controlled the moral life of England as he was a Puritan, and prohibited dancing, gambling, alcohol, and this seriously alienated many English people. When he died in 1658, he was succeeded by his son Richard, but he was ineffective as a ruler, and therefore the Stuarts were restored to the throne in 1660. Charles II was the new king, and he was not an absolutist, as Parliament was now stronger than the king than it had ever been before. He was known as a merry monarch, and also during this time, there was the development of political parties. The Whigs were the more liberals, and then they supported Parliament, and then the Tories, the more conservative ones, supported the monarchy. The Clarendon Code was instituted by the monarchy, and it drove all Puritans out of political and religious life. The Test Act of 1673 excluded those who were not Anglican from voting, holding office, teaching, attending universities, and it was pretty discriminatory, and it heightened religious tensions during this time. And Charles also seemed to support Catholicism, as he granted freedom of worship to them, and he made a secret pact with Louis XIV, whereby France would give England funds in exchange for relaxed restrictions on Catholics. Charles also dissolved Parliament when it passed a law that there could be no more Catholic kings. And after Charles II, there was James II, and he also continued this support of Catholics. He made Catholics eligible for office. People felt that he was trying to reestablish Catholicism, so English Protestants were anxious. This resulted in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. A parliament asked William III and Mary II from the Netherlands in Orange to come to England to rule. So William prepared to invade England from the Netherlands, and James II had no backing powers, as most of them were focused on territorial expansion during this time. So James II flies to France in exile, and the William and Mary are now ruling England together. England became a constitutional monarchy, and the Bill of Rights was established, which provisioned that kings could not be Roman Catholic, laws could only be made with consent of Parliament, Parliament had right of free speech, no martial law, and taxation needed consent of Parliament. It also included the Habeas Corpus Act, which enabled judges to demand that prisoners have to be in court during their trials. There needed to be a cause for imprisonment, speedy trials, and there was no double jeopardy. It also included the petition of right. And the Glorious Revolution pleased philosopher John Locke, as this was the way that government should be limited, and it's demonstrated that when people feel that their rights are being limited by their government, they have the right to revolt. However, it did not amount to a democratic revolution, as power still was largely in the hands of nobility during this time.